If your draft falls apart by chapter 3, the real problem started on page 1, and it's not your prologue. It's what's missing from your very first line. Readers need an instant reason to care. That's the whole job of a novel's opening lines. It's what hooks them, makes them want to keep reading to find out more. So let's look at the 5 most common ways sci-fi and fantasy authors fail to make the most of those crucial opening pages, and what you can do instead to keep readers hooked and your draft moving all the way through. Number 1, no named character. One of the fastest ways to lose a reader in your opening is to delay naming a character, and a vague pronoun doesn't count unless you're writing in first person. You might think you're creating atmosphere or that the name doesn't matter yet, but from a reader psychology perspective, it absolutely does. In those first few lines, the reader is trying to make sense of the world you've dropped them into, and without a clear character to orient how they can care about it, they're forced to process the scene in the abstract, without meaningful context, emotion, or direction. Let me demonstrate with a real example, though anonymized details, from the initial draft one writer sent me for editing. The fireball missed the witch's head, but the ends of her silver braid, swinging as she sprinted down the alley, caught fire. High action and magic, right? So why doesn't starting this way work? While it gives us the right fantasy genre promise as the readers, the action doesn't mean anything for us yet. We don't know why we should care about the action because we don't even know who we're rooting for. We now know from cognitive neuroscience, readers don't passively receive a story. They start actively simulating it from the very first line. They're trying to predict what's coming next, drawing on memory, emotion, and internal pattern recognition. But that immersive process only kicks in when the reader has something to attach those feelings to. So even in the first person, it's best to sneak in a name as soon as you naturally can. It's a signal to the reader. This is who we're with. This is whose story we're stepping into. And that's what allows the brain to start assigning emotional weight. Skip that, and everything else you show, your gorgeous setting, your high-stakes conflict, has no one to live it through. And that means the reader has no reason to care. So yes, even if you're going for mystery or want to reveal more in the next paragraph, you've probably already lost precious seconds of emotional connection. Seconds your story can't afford to waste, especially in a world where most readers decide to keep reading within the first page. A well-known and loved author has established promises already built in for what readers can expect. So they're more willing to keep reading because they trust the author to deliver, whether or not the first line creates solid connection. But if that's not you yet, you can simply name your point of view character to help orient your readers and keep them reading. It doesn't mean you need a full backstory or monologue, but we do need to know who we're with so we can start feeling the story as it happens. That's how connection begins, and it starts the moment they meet your protagonist. Number 2, no stakes or tension. But while naming a character in your first line helps a ton, it's not enough on its own, because without tension, there's still nothing for the reader to care about. Fiction feels real because it hijacks our emotional memory systems. When we read, the character serves as a neural proxy for our own experiences. Through a mix of memory activation and neural mirroring, we begin mapping the character's emotions onto our own internal world. But that only happens when there's something emotionally charged on the page, something the character wants, fears, or needs to act on. Let me show you what happens when that's missing. Here's a real example from an early draft I received for editing, with details changed for privacy. Ada slid the ship door open and stuck her head in the stagnant, rotten egg air. There's some solid sensory detail here. We can visualize it, smell it even, but we have no real reason to care because Ada doesn't seem to care. There's no signal about what this moment means to her or what she's about to do. It's not tension, it's just description. Here's another. I reached down to grab the last box, staring intently at the writing. We've got a first-person narrator, a clear physical action, but there's no conflict, no emotional signal. Is this memory-laden writing, a Cursed artifact? A shipping label? We don't know because there's no tension to interpret it through. That's the real issue. Tension isn't about action, it's about meaning for the character. The moment the character enters the scene, the reader should start subconsciously asking emotionally resonant questions. Not just what's happening, but what's at stake here and why does it matter? And if you don't know what tension your character is carrying on page 1, chances are your draft will fizzle out by chapter 3. This is probably the number one thing that gets an author stuck and unable to see the story through. If your story isn't tapping into theme carrying tension from the start, you're not just losing your reader, you're losing your reason to keep writing it. You won't know what direction to go next because there's no core enough thread to pull you through to the end. So, what's the fix? Make sure your opening lines do double duty. Yes, name your character, but also signal what they want, what's in their way, or what inner pressure they're carrying. Let's revise one of those earlier lines. Ada slid the ship door open, bracing herself for the stench, and the answer waiting inside. Now, there's tension. The air still reeks, but Ada has a reason to care, and we do too. And suddenly, we're more invested in what happens next. Or take this one. I bent to lift the final box, but stalled. Her handwriting, still steady, stared back at me as if nothing had changed. Suddenly, the box isn't just a box. It's a doorway to grief, memory, and mystery. There's a hook. That's the key. Emotional tension doesn't require explosive action. It just requires meaning. Even a flicker of guilt, a moment of dread, or a thread of hope can transform a static observation into something readers can care about through their character proxy. That's how you build momentum, not just for your reader, but for yourself to better express on the page all the emotion you feel in the story without that disconnect that keeps stalling early in the draft. And if you want a brain science-based breakdown of the 3 key things readers need from your story, you can grab my free map to a marketable book. It's linked in the description below. Number 3, too many in-world terms. This is one of the most common immersion killers in sci-fi and fantasy drafts, dropping too many invented terms too soon. Writers often want to establish their world's uniqueness right away. They want that speculative promise and to make sure they're providing context for the everything that's about to go down. But when your opening is packed with unfamiliar vocabulary, it backfires. Let me show you what I mean with a real example from an early client draft. Again, anonymized for privacy. The ethereal glow of the Valens shimmered through the pines of Inworld, casting spirals across the cliffs of Elgareth. Beautiful? Sure. Atmospheric? Definitely. But immersive? Not yet. Because we don't actually know what any of it means. There's no character perspective lens to show us how we should care about the atmosphere or what it means. So all that effort you put into painting a vivid scene, it becomes too much noise to take in before the reader's brain knows what to do with it. Here's why. Mental imagery is one of the strongest drivers of immersion, but only when the brain has a frame to interpret it. Cognitive research shows that readers form vivid mental pictures by mapping new story information onto what they already know. You need to scaffold your world-building info and terms so that readers can layer the new on the familiar. But if the first sentence is loaded with invented terms, the reader has nowhere to place all those details. There's no familiar for that leap into the new from. So what's the fix? Don't start with the world in the first line. Start with a moment of emotional significance for your character. You can still showcase your world's unique elements, but they should be revealed through what your protagonist notices, reacts to, or wants, and preferably scaffolded throughout more of the opening than the first line. For example, I clutched the broken rune, its edges still glowing with Valen light, and prayed the elders were wrong about what it meant. Even if I'm not sure, I'd recommend that this be the opening sentence. Now, Valen gets some context. There's emotional tension, stakes, a POV filter. We may not know exactly what a Valen is, but we know why it matters. And that's what makes us want to read on. Remember, your world building should raise questions, not confusion. Terms don't need full explanations right away, but they do need to carry emotional weight. not just novelty. Because if your reader is too busy trying to decipher your terminology, they won't have enough cognitive space left to care about your character's journey. And that's what makes stories stick with readers long after the last page. Number 4, starting with setting or lore instead of character. This is one of the most common pitfalls in sci-fi and fantasy openings, especially when the author has spent a lot of time developing their world. The temptation is to begin with magical weather, ancient prophecies, or a sweeping cinematic view of the landscape. Here's a real example from an early draft with some details changed for anonymity. As always at twilight, and again at first light, the dusk veil crept down the ridge, curling over the valley floor and into the forested lowlands. The pretty prose starts in a zoomed-out view of setting, but a novel isn't a movie where this might work better. There's no character, no reason for empathy to trigger those mirror neurons, no tension, so the reader can't yet care. Readers form emotional connections through relevance and simulation. In other words, their brains won't retain your world setting or lore just because you gave it to them. They'll retain it if they feel why it matters to the character. Otherwise, there's no emotional memory attached, and no hook for the brain to process or care. So when you front load your story with world building, regardless of how subtly it's delivered, you're still overwhelming the reader with unanchored data. To get a reader more physiologically involved, it still needs the internality of a character proxy. In other words, a point of view character's perspective of this landscape and phenomenon. When we start in abstract setting, there's no perspective for how to interpret it in the context of this world, what to feel, what to focus on, what matters. So how do we fix that? You don't need to strip your opening of all atmosphere, but bring it through the character's experience. Let the setting reflect something about what they're feeling or what they're about to do. For example, Mara tightened her grip on the lantern. The dusk veil was early, and if it reached the valley floor before she crossed the lowlands, she wouldn't make it back. Same mood, same world, but now it matters because a character is in it and we know what's at stake. That's what pulls readers in. That's how you get them to fall in love with your world because they have empathy for those walking through it. Number 5, false starts and genre bait and switch. Some first lines or even entire openings don't just confuse readers, they mislead them. This happens when the story starts with a dream, a memory, or a metaphorical image that doesn't reflect the tone, perspective, or genre of the book's core narrative. Readers might assume the story is one thing, only to feel jarred when the real story begins later or in chapter 1. Here's an example from an early draft I edited. Somewhere, deep in the slivered haze of memory, it glimmered. That one day. It's lyrical, poetic, but it's also vague and disconnected from any clear character or genre. In this draft, it opened a prologue of memory, but it wasn't where the real story began. There was no now, no tension, no POV, and the tone was rather different from the more grounded, contemporary, speculative story tone that followed. So readers had to essentially restart at chapter 1. This issue also shows up in stories that open with dreams, philosophical musings, flashbacks, or cryptic prophecies. These kinds of openings mess with something crucial: reader expectations. Recent narrative psychology shows that readers begin simulating the story almost immediately, using past emotional experiences, narrative pattern recognition, and internal predictions to immerse themselves in the world. But that process only works when the story's opening makes promises it intends to keep. So when your story opens in a tone or creates connection to a character or setting that doesn't match the rest of your book, it fractures immersion. It breaks your careful story spell that you and readers want to stay under. It's not the experience readers thought they signed up for. Now, to be clear, there's room for twists, mystery, metaphor, even for dreamlike language, but it needs to serve the story's larger promise and message. If your opening sets up expectations your novel doesn't fulfill, you risk losing reader trust before the real story even begins. So make the right promises in your opening by making sure it represents the same mode of storytelling, the same experience your novel is about to deliver. That means starting with a grounded perspective, genre-consistent tone, and emotional tension that matters to your POV character. You can still be poetic, you can still build mystery, but do it through the eyes of a character your readers will follow, and do it in a way that the transportive immersion in the rest of your story satisfactorily fulfills. Because when your opening builds the wrong expectations, your reader won't just feel confused, they'll feel misled. And that's not how reader enchantment begins. Your first few pages really do shape the rest of your draft. When you start with the wrong promises, you're not just confusing your reader, you're making it harder for yourself to keep writing. So fixing your opening can take you a long way, but if you're one of those many writers who has polished the opening 1,000 times and can't seem to get anywhere with this draft, I'm going to help you finally move to the next stage. I'm sharing the story of a writer who was stuck in drafting mode on and off for 5 years, and what finally helped her finish her draft in just 12 weeks. It's in the next video on your screen now.